So, uh, progressive models in resistance training. This is the way I'm going to do this. It'll work the way it works. There is the ACSM position stand. A couple comments I'll make real quick. When you look at the people that are the editors of this is from 2009, so hopefully they'll come out with a new one. There's the general exercise one, and then there's one for resistance exercise. I like this one for resistance exercise. It kind of goes more in depth. So for resistance exercise, we'll use this. So a couple quick comments. One, the people that wrote this are the same people that are involved in the National Strength and Conditioning Association. So the top people in both the ACSM and National Strength and Conditioning are basically the same people. This follows the research base. So a lot of times when you have a new novel program, it takes time for you to develop research around that to know, okay, how is this going to affect things? And then you can comment on it, and experts can agree and disagree and whatever. But you as the clinician, you have this new novel type of exercise program. Is it work? Is it not work? We'll talk about some of those later. This deals with basics of exercise prescription regarding resistance exercise. And this is what the field has kind of developed for itself. So some of the other peripheral issues we'll deal with later. We'll go through this document. And I know you're thinking, what the hell? He's got a research article right there. This doesn't look good. Okay. We want to make that smaller. Actually, no, this will work. This will work. So this is page 700 of that document. No, it's not 700 pages long. It's, when they published it, it came out to page 700. And the nice thing about this is that it's like a cheat sheet. So you can read the article, and I recommend that you read the article. But this kind of consolidates this and puts all the information into one concise place. So this is what I'm going to go through. I didn't feel like it. Rewriting all of this information into various different PowerPoints. So yeah, the format that I'm using to give this to you is not the best, and I realize that. But I am going through this sheet, and I do feel like that's important, and that's what I'm going to do. So a couple of things. Why do I say that? I'm going to go over the grade. What does the grade mean? The grade is talking about the level and the type of research used to back up those statements. So they're talking about the level of evidence to support it. They break that down somewhere previously. Am I making you dizzy? I hope so. Okay. Yeah, it wasn't that funny. Okay, well, it's listed somewhere in here. It's also listed in the other article. I'm not going to go through it all. It's just going to be annoying. But it's talking about the level of studies. It's talking about the level of studies. So it's not saying that this evidence is better than other evidence. It's just saying that we have a lot of evidence to support this. We have clinical trials to support this. We have observational studies to support this. Even the level D, which is not even stated in this as the grades here, even level D is the expert consensus. So a lot of information that you get from me is level D information, my expert opinion. A lot of the stuff that I tell you is supported in evidence. That would have an A, B, or C level of support. But then a lot of things, especially with resistance training, comes down to going into exercise physiology, kinesiology, biomechanics, taking a look at it, and then developing either your own opinion or a consensus opinion. There's not necessarily a real evidence base to support, but it follows other things that have an evidence base, so it should be okay. So we deal with a lot of that. That's what the discussion is geared towards. But that's level D. This is all better than that. So this is all based on research trials. So I think it's important to realize that, you know, this isn't just people making stuff up. There's a lot of evidence to support this. Now, if you disagree with some of this information, or you question some of this information, I would recommend that you read the rest of the position stance. Sometimes it clarifies it. But also bring that up in a lecture and discussion, and we can discuss and figure out what's going on with it. There are some things that I think are a little weird, so I'll address those as I go through it. So we've got strength training. First off, what is strength training? Think about it. They're talking about the hardcore definitions of strength training, muscle hypertrophy. There's another one for muscular endurance. Strength training is referring to getting stronger. So with that, a lot of the resistance exercise programs you do at the start are going to be pretty similar for the novice. The novice is going to gain strength. They're going to gain muscle hypertrophy, muscular endurance. The programs at the novice level are often pretty similar. But once you get to the hardcore individual, the individual that does a lot of resistance exercise, I'll try to use the term resistance exercise to kind of encompass everything. But when you're looking at resistance exercise and you look at you guys, people at the ARC, and the things that you're doing, you're not really doing strength training. You're doing probably muscular hypertrophy. I think the muscular hypertrophy routines fit in more with what most of the people are doing at the ARC. The muscular endurance is more so what people are doing at the ARC rather than the hardcore strength training. So kind of make sure that you understand the terms and the goals associated with those terms. Yes, in the general media and in a lot of situations, they're used interchangeably. And that's probably all right. But in this class, you need to kind of know the technical difference and work with those technical differences to make sure that the things that you say are appropriate. So for strength training, we have concentric, eccentric, isometric actions, and they say for the novice, intermediate, and advanced. Training loads of 60 to 70% of 1RM. I'm a huge fan of doing 1RM testing. Do a maximal lift with proper form. You got to make sure that the exercise isn't necessarily complex. Things like deadlifts and even the back squat, the standard squat people do, that can be pretty challenging for a 1 rep max. So you need to make sure that the exercise is safe. But for a lot of other exercises, to figure out what's their maximal capacity is useful. Because from there you can determine percentages to get people into the right zone. So the big problem I find that you run into is you have people lifting too much weight. That's usually the guys. They'll go in, they'll do bench, a 1 rep max bench, and then leave, and that's their strength training. The girls, stereotyping, but the girls, they'll do weights that are too low. I'm talking about the novice, right off the street type person. They do weights that are too low. They don't get a real benefit from it, and they're not even necessarily doing the exercise properly. So for the guys, you see them doing a quarter squat with a ton of weight. For the girls, you'll see them doing a lat pull down, and they bring the bar down to their belly button. Their weight's not appropriate. So figuring out that appropriate weight and doing some sort of maximal lifting. I think in the lab you'll do percentage, or you'll do a 2 to 5 rep max and then extrapolate to your max. If you want to go that route, that's fine. I have found the 1 rep max to be easy and safe. But if for whatever reason you don't feel comfortable doing it, and with certain exercises, like I would never do a 1 rep max even when I did back squats. I would never do a 1 rep max because I never felt comfortable doing the heavy weight with good form. So doing some sort of percentage of a rep max was more what I would do, just because I felt more comfortable. I could get to levels of fatigue and difficulty completing the set and things like that, but doing a 1 rep max, I never felt comfortable with it. So training load 60 to 70% of the 1RM. You could try to estimate that. They should 8 to 12 repetitions should be what they can accomplish. If they can accomplish more, probably increase the weight if you're not getting a 1 rep max, which is probably what most people are doing. Most people just guess the weight, they put the pin in. If that's the method that you're using, shame. But if that's the method that you're using, then if you could do more than 12 reps, I would start increasing the weight and that's a standard way a lot of people do it, and that's generally pretty much fine. The intermediate, so 8 to 12 reps for novice to intermediate individuals, and cycling loads of 80 to 100% of 1 RM for advanced individuals. So the 80% 1 RM, you're probably going to get about 8 reps with that. Obviously, if you do 100%, you're only going to get 1 rep of that, and people will do varieties of that. When training at a specific rep max, it's recommended to increase 2 to 10% in load. The 2 to 10% is fine. You got to use a little bit of sense with it. If you've got a novice individual and they're lifting 10 pounds on the machine, and then you're going to increase it, and you increase it by the half weight that they have, and you put that on there, so you're increasing it by 5 pounds, you've now increased it technically by 50%. That is, on one hand, it sounds utterly ridiculous, but are you going to increase it by even 10% would mean that you're just putting a 1 pound magnetic plate, which your facility may or may not even have, a 1 pound magnetic plate onto the weight that you're lifting. And sometimes it's hard to get to those low level increments. So especially with people lifting lower amounts of weight. So use your discretion. I would use the rep max and a little bit of ratings of perceived exertion to kind of go along with it. For people lifting higher levels of weights, yes, the 2 to 10% will work and is appropriate. But when you're dealing with the lower levels, it's sometimes hard to achieve that low of an amount of weight. So 1 to 2 repetitions over the desired numbers on 2 consecutive training sessions. So that's why I said if you're doing 12 reps, if you could do 13, 14, increase the weight. Recommended 1 to 3 sets for the novice. Keep in mind, novice. So we're talking about 1 to 3 sets for the novice. Now, you might not be a novice, so you will likely be doing more. You are probably not even doing strength training. From this perspective, you're doing more muscle hypertrophy training, which has a different set of guidelines to go along with it. So kind of keep those things in mind as you're going through. Multi-set programs are recommended for progression to intermediate and advanced. So if you're doing more than 3 sets, that's fine, is what it's saying. Unilateral and bilateral, single, multi-joint should be included with emphasis on multi-joint exercises. So everybody should be doing multi-joint exercises. We'll break down the different ways people could do resistance exercise in another PowerPoint. Yay! But for now, we'll stick with traditional resistance exercise, the weight machines and free weights. I prefer the free weights just because it has more of a balance. I think free weights are better because they have the balance component. You may need to adjust the weight. You may need to remediate, which is another PowerPoint. The exercise, the strength and conditioning folks talk more about that, the exercise. But, do a weight that you can do properly with good form. And if that's just your body weight, that's fine. Try to incorporate that balance component. I think that's very important. The weight machines, it's more of, in my mind, it's a little bit passé, especially the ones that would isolate. That was a big thing in the 80s. We want to isolate the biceps. We want to isolate the pecs. We want to isolate the triceps. You like that? Why are we isolating? We don't just, when in life are you standing by something doing, this? You probably not. So doing multi-joint what is called functional exercises is fine and is recommended. And I think even if you're doing traditional strength training in the weight room, to do things where you're using free weights, is better than necessarily a machine. Now, a machine may be needed in certain instances. That's fine, but generally speaking, I would opt much more for the free weight type of situation. Free weights and machines should be included in novice to intermediate training. You'll see a lot of people doing this. For advanced, it's recommended the emphasis be put on free weights. My opinion, and I think the field is moving towards, I think everybody should be leaning towards free weights. It's not necessarily everybody in every situation, but I think the majority of exercise, resistance exercise, should be pushed in that direction. With machines used as a complement, sequencing exercises, large muscle groups before smaller muscle groups, I think that's pretty standard. Multi-joint before single joint, higher intensity before lower intensity. And then the big thing here is rotating upper and lower body opposing exercises. So, and this is a big thing. If you're doing it in the same day, rotating upper and lower body. If you're just doing all upper body one day and all lower body the other day, then you're rotating kind of the area between exercise sessions. And I think that's what most of you do, and it's stated later. That's fine. That's fine. But the one thing you have to watch out for with all of this is that a consistent problem with upper body is just wearing out your shoulders. Because you're never giving the muscles that support your shoulders, all the muscles that support your rotator cuff, you're never giving those muscles a break. Those muscles are going to be used whether you do a bicep curl or whether you do a tricep push down or a power lift or a bench press. They're always being used, and if you don't give them a break, then you risk increasing your risk of injury. So the thing you've got to watch out for is making sure that your body has sufficient rest between subsequent days, and that's where a lot of people can run into making a mistake where they say, "Oh, I'm doing chest and buys today. I'm going to do shoulders and lats, triceps, whatever." If you do a push pull, I think push pull is what you see more people doing. But even if you do a push pull type of routine, I do shoulders, I do chest. I do triceps, and then I do biceps and back, lats, whatever. I do that on the opposing days. The problem is those supporting muscles associated with the shoulder joint in particular. So make sure that you give those adequate rest. The rest period, 2 to 3 minutes. If you're using heavier weights, 1 to 2 minutes may also suffice. Generally speaking, across the board, what you kind of consistently see, and when you're looking at this, kind of look for the consistencies. It will help you learn this. You'll see a lot of things are just the same. The novice recommendations are basically the same for whether it's strength, endurance, or hypertrophy. If you're looking at rest periods or the speed of the movement, a lot of it across the board is the same. Now, you may tweak it depending on your goals, and that's fine, but you can kind of see a level of consistency, and that rest period of essentially a minute, maybe 2, is pretty consistent. A little bit longer rest periods if you're concentrating on strength, but generally the 1 to 2 minutes works well. For untrained individuals, it's recommended that slow and moderate concentric velocities are used. For intermediate, moderate velocity, the moderate velocity is basically 1 second, 1 second. You could say 1 second, 2 seconds, so maybe a little slower on the eccentric, that's fine. But you don't want it to be super slow, and you don't want it to be herky-jerky. And that's a big thing, is that people will jerk that weight around, or they'll cheat. You want to make sure that it's done with proper form and a reasonable speed. The 1 second concentric, 1 to 2 seconds eccentric is the comfortable speed that most people will do a normal repetition, and that's a good speed to do things at. For advanced, they could do a continuum of velocities, especially when you factor in power training. It should correspond to the intensity. Sometimes with heavier weight, you just have to do it slower because you're having more difficulty lifting the weight. That's obviously fine. For the novice, 2 to 3 days per week. The progression to intermediate is 3 to 4 days, but usually then you're splitting up your workout between upper body and lower body. And for advanced, they may do 4 to 6 days per week. Now with this hypertrophy, what you hear in the general lay media is you do heavy weight, low reps. This, if you look close enough, and it'll state it in other places in the article, but it's consistent with that, because if you're doing 80 to 100% of your 1RM, you're doing heavier weight, and you're not going to be able to do them for as many repetitions. So it is consistent. You're looking at 2 to 3 minutes. You know, you could tweak that, but what you don't want to do, and I did this, is you go to a fitness facility, you go to the Arc. It's a social type of thing. You do 1 set, you talk, you take a break, 5 minutes later, 10 minutes later, you come back and you do another set. Usually it wasn't that bad, to be honest. But sometimes there were longer rest periods in there, and that's what, you know, if it happens, it happens. But you don't want that to be the consistent way people are exercising. That you don't want. A little bit longer break if you're doing strength, concentrating on strength, fine. But even then, 2 to 3 minutes is kind of what they're saying in most instances. Muscle hypertrophy. Any questions? No? Good. Muscle hypertrophy. This is what, when you look at the programs, this is what most people are kind of working at. For the novice and intermediate, moderate loading, 70 to 85%. What I think is funny is that for strength, they're saying 60 to 70, and here they're saying 70 to 85, and the reps are the same. So what gives? I don't get it. It doesn't make any sense. The issue there is that we're looking at research studies. In these research studies for strength training, they use 60 to 70% 1RM as the stimulus. For hypertrophy studies, they use 70 to 85% of the 1RM. I guess the good news is you can kind of mix and match. As I said previously, for a novice, it's all the same. Anything you do is going to improve their strength, their endurance, their hypertrophy. It doesn't matter what you do. You do want to follow some basics, but just starting a strength training, you're going to see improvements. So this is one area where students usually just like, okay, moving on. But you should really be like, well, geez, that doesn't make any sense, and it doesn't make sense. And really, the reason is just, they just didn't do a study looking at both or whatever. One study looked at hypertrophy, another looked at training, strength training, and this is kind of the way they set things up. So this is the way they developed the recommendation. But it is kind of a weird type of thing. It's 1 to 3 sets, the same amount of sets basically. And for advanced, they're saying 70 to 100% of 1RM, 1 to 12 repetitions, 3 to 6 sets. So you're increasing the number of sets. They don't give you a set number. I'd imagine they probably do somewhere in the article. I'm not going to hold you to it, but if you're interested, you should look into it. Generally, the number of sets, I think they even put it up to as far as 8 sets. It's going to vary. You don't want to do too many sets, and I remember in college I would do 10 to 15 sets a muscle group, and that was overtraining. I was doing too much. But generally speaking, I'd say, and I'd have to read the article again or find it. I think the top end they usually put is somewhere around 8, but the 1 to 12 repetitions, 3 to 6 sets. So you're doing a lot more sets. You're doing it in a periodized manner. We'll talk about periodization later, and different ways to train in another PowerPoint. The majority of the training should be 6 to 12 RM and less devoted to 1 to 6 RM training, so repetition max. So when you're looking at it, yeah, you're going to go a little bit heavier weight, but it should not be all of this like one rep and then take a break, 1 rep, take a break. And I think this is probably what most people are doing, or something close to it. The single and multi-joint, free weight, and machine are recommended. The sequencing is the same. I'll even say that, similar to strength training. 1 to 2 minute rest period for intermediate, advanced. The rest period could correspond to the goals of the exercise. 2 to 3 minute, and if it's heavy loading, for heavy loading and for core exercise. And 1 to 2 minutes for most of the other exercise. So again, this is pretty consistent with what we see for strength. The big difference is, it's what's in the pop culture and what you've heard, and because it kind of lines up with the science as well. But the strength training is heavier weight, lower rep, and the muscle hypertrophy is kind of an in-between of endurance and strength, where it's moderately heavy weight and moderate number of reps, and that's what most of the folks are doing out there is kind of what I've found. So the slow to moderate velocities in the novice, and intermediate for advanced, is recommended that slow, moderate, and fast repetitions be used depending on load, repetition number, and goals. With fast, the key that you have to remember is proper form. We don't want people to do things in a manner where there's a lot of momentum and you can hurt yourself. We don't want that. We want people to do things with proper, good form. If you could do that in a fast way, that works on power, that's great. But if you cannot do it in a proper way, then don't do it. So with bicep curls especially, and I was boss with bicep curls, a lot of people will, I'll turn to the side. A lot of people will do that hip thrust. I don't know how well you can see it. That's bad for your back. It's not the way you should be doing it. If people are doing a deadlift, you'll see a lot of rounded backs. When people are using kettlebells, you'll see a lot of rounded backs. Ooh, very bad, very bad. So we don't want people to do it faster and then make that error. We want them to do it with proper form. When we get into power in just a second, people will be doing, you have to do the movement faster in order to create the momentum to lift the weight. And that's okay, but we want to make sure it's done with proper form. So kind of keep that in mind. And ironically, and it mentions it in the power, when we do things fast, we're doing things with a lower amount of weight. So the reality is when people are doing strength training and they're having a hard time lifting it, they try to use momentum and they cheat. That is not what this is recommending. People will take it and run with that, and they will do that, but that's not what is being recommended. So kind of think about it. What makes sense? How do I prevent injury? How do I improve performance? How do I improve health? What can this do for me, and how can this hurt me? And you don't want to do things that hurt you. So for intermediate, the recommendation is similar to the total body workout, or 4 days a week, when using an upper and lower body split routine. For advanced, it could go up to 4 to 6 days a week, to kind of keep those things in mind. And I'll mention it here. Actually, why don't you take a break? Because you need a break. So just hit pause, and then I'll keep talking. Okay, so now we're back. and I didn't go anywhere. I didn't take a break. So one thing that you have to watch with this, and I'll just make this note, is that if you're doing a lot of one thing, not neglecting the other stuff. So I know with the activity trackers, I become a slave to my activity tracker. Slave is probably not a good word, but I'll look at it and I'm like, oh, I didn't get enough steps today. I need to get more steps. And that's not good. What I should be doing is I should say, oh, I need to get more resistance. I haven't done a resistance training workout in a couple days. I should do a resistance training workout. And I've got 30 minutes. I could either go on the treadmill, or I could run outside, or I could get on the bike, or I could do strength training. And geez, I should do strength training. That should be my priority. That's the way it should be. That's not the way it is. And when you have an activity that you enjoy, or when you have an activity that you prefer, that's fine. When you get to the higher levels of meeting the recommendations for that activity, then you should think about and consider, let me do some of the other activity. Should you really be doing 6 days a week of resistance training? I'm doing 4 or 5 days of resistance training. Do I really need a 6th day? Probably not. What you should do is somewhere intersperse that 1 or 2 days and try to get a little bit more aerobic training, a little bit more of the other types of stuff in there, ideally. So kind of keep that in mind, that we have these recommendations. You can work out at the upper ends of those recommendations, and that's fine. You will gravitate towards those if those are your preferences. That's fine. But what you should watch out for is that doesn't dominate your activity and take the place of potentially some other things that you should be doing that at that point would be more beneficial for you. So moving on, muscular power. I know I talked about this in one of the classes. And, you got to think about what is muscular power. What's the definition of power? So power is force times time. It's how quickly you can move a mass, essentially. So the mass could be your own personal mass. It could be a weight that you're lifting. If you're looking at sport, especially football, power is way more important than strength and way more important than hypertrophy. You want to be able to move and move quickly. The athletes, the players that can move and move quickly are the most successful. If you're slow but you can lift a huge amount of weight, it's not that great. You look at strongman competitions; they're super strong, but they're not in the NFL. If they were able to go into the NFL, they'd be in the NFL, because you can make a lot more money playing professional football than you can doing strongman competitions, and you don't see that. So kind of keep in mind that I think I'm saying that a lot. Keep in mind that just because you're doing a lot of one thing, it's going to help, but it doesn't necessarily make you excel at those other areas. So with muscular power is important. Muscular power is how quickly you can move with good form. And when you think about it from that perspective, you can develop and incorporate power types of movements, power concepts when you're working with the general population that really wouldn't do stereotypical power lifting. So when we think of power lifting, we're usually thinking of deadlifts, power cleans, squats, the clean and jerk, and all those types of Olympic lifts. We're thinking of those types of things. At least I'm usually thinking of that when I think of power. But it could be a lot of other things. It could be how quickly, if you do a get up and go test, so you have an older individual get up from a chair, and how quickly can they take, a couple steps, and you time it. We wouldn't do that on ourselves because it would be hard to time, because people would be able to do it so fast. But in an older population, that's something you could time. That's power. As I mentioned, at least to one of the classes, I had my mom get up from the ground. That's a type of power type of movement. And what we could do is then time it and then see, okay, can you do it a little faster? Can you do it a little faster? Can you do it a little faster? That is incorporating power into the exercises. Power is good for everybody. What they saw in the older populations is that when they did power training, so this type of trying to move and coordinate your movement faster, that it decreased braking time in the car, which when I heard that, I was like, I'm all for power. They were able to, their reflexes were quicker, they could coordinate their movement quicker, and that translated into being able to hit the brake pedal faster when they tested them. So I thought that was interesting, and it put a kind of a practical spin on why this thing is useful. So everybody should do it. Predominantly multi-joint exercises. The sequencing and guidelines are similar to strength for novice, intermediate, and advanced. It's recommended that it's done in conjunction with a strength training program. Do 1 to 3 sets per exercise. Use light to moderate weight. So typically when we see powerlifting, we see it in the Olympics. And we see people performing a 1 rep max, and their form might be a little iffy, but they're trying to lift as much weight as they possibly can. When we're doing this in a clinical setting or a commercial setting, a strength and conditioning setting, and even when I talked to an individual that was doing this and was competing at it, and he was at the Olympic Training Center out in Colorado, he said they did this there as well, and it makes sense because this is what follows the research. This is what they found works. So they would do 30 to 60% for upper body, 0 to 60, so 0 being just your body weight, to 60% of your 1 repetition max. Again, it's a fairly moderate to low weight that you're lifting. It's a complex movement. They make sure that they do the exercise perfectly. We don't see these people doing the exercises perfectly day in and day out and getting that form down. But that's what they should be doing. They do it for 3 to 6 repetitions. They are not doing it to failure. So it's a little bit different. And when you consider the types of exercises and the complexity, the risk of injury, if it's done improperly, we want to make sure that it's done perfectly, and then that's it. We don't want to get into this, a little bit of cheating's okay. No. We want to make sure that the exercise or the movements are done perfectly. So that's especially true for the Olympic lifts. If you're working with some of these other types of things, like an older individual, and you're just trying to get them off of the ground, what's perfect form? There it may be a little bit, you may have a little bit of wiggle room because you're trying to teach a concept and you're trying to get them to improve. But even if you're doing like a burpee or a squat, jump, things like that, we would still, especially if you're doing it on a power level where you have momentum, we'd want to try to make sure that it's done with proper form. So that proper form is important. Various loading strategies for the advanced. There's heavy loading is necessary for increasing force, and light to moderate loading. So, okay, they may do a couple heavy things, but generally they're staying in this 30 to 60 zone. Multi-set, 3 to 6 set power programs be integrated into a strength. 1 to 6 reps in a periodized manner is recommended. For people working in the power aspects, maybe even the football players, they will do this. For us, for the general population, it's more so incorporating power concepts into the exercises and movements that we do. Like one thing that people do is they'll have a sled, and they'll put weight on a sled, and then they'll pull it or push it. That would be another power type of movement. Rest periods, it looks like it's the same for everything. 2 to 3 minutes. for high intensity, for assistance exercise, and those of lower intensity, and that's the one area where they say it's an expert opinion. Shorter rest interval, 1 to 2 minutes. I will say, because a lot of these, I guess it depends on how you do them and to what intensity you do them. If you're using your whole body, it takes more out of you. Now, you shouldn't do as many reps, and the weight should be less, so that will decrease it. If you're doing the exercise and you're exhausted afterwards, yeah, you're going to need a little more rest. So you kind of use some judgment. The recommended frequency for novice is similar to strength training, 2 to 3 days per week. And all these, if you're doing the power or power aspects, you just incorporate it into the rest of the resistance training program. For the intermediate power training, recommended entire total body or upper lower body split. Working out used at a frequency of 3 to 4 days per week. Advanced may do 4 to 5. Is recommended using predominantly total body or upper lower body split. And depending on the exercise, I mean, it's a total body exercise, so you can't help but use everything together. A lot of times with the power movements, they will remediate, and they'll break it down so that people can work at a specific aspect of the movement and improve their performance in something where they may have a limitation, or it might be the weak link in the movement that they're doing. So you'll see that as well. So a local muscular endurance. So this is when you look at the continuum, it's higher rep, less weight. People are doing a mix of this. But I would say with muscular endurance, you need to make sure that the rep level is reasonable. So make sure that the number of reps that you're completing are reasonable. Okay, this thing is jumping up at the bottom, so we'll see what the heck it's talking about. Oh, it's something different. Okay. Oh, crap, no. Okay. So back to local muscular endurance. So as I was stating, it's typically the higher weight, or excuse me, lower weight, higher rep. And what you got to keep in mind with this, you always got to think about, what are people going to do? How are they going to manipulate this information? And how are they going to find loopholes with this information? What we want, and what you got to keep in mind, is we want a good, holistic program. So if people are trying to find loopholes, we don't want loopholes. If they're making mistakes, we want to fix those mistakes. Lots of different ways to do things. The mistake I see is people are underperforming the amount of activity that they should do. They say, oh, I'm doing higher reps, less weight, but the weight that they're doing is actually like pitiful. If you're doing bicep curls with like 2 pounds, you could do that till you're blue in the face. You're not reaching a stimulus that's going to improve your strength or really do much of anything. So you could say, I'm working on muscular endurance, but make sure that those weights are reasonable so that you could at least get the 10 to 15 reps. You may go upwards up to 10 to 25 reps, that's fine. But at the end, you should feel, even if you do 100 reps, you should feel fatigued and like that stimulus was appropriate. And making sure that the weight or the complexity of the movement is in line with the number of reps you're performing. That's what you want to watch out for. So as with the rest of them, unilateral, bilateral, single joint, various sequencing, combination, novice, intermediate, advanced. It's recommended to use lighter loads for 10 to 15 reps. They don't give a rep max per se, but use lighter loads. So this is where you have to use your judgment to make sure that the stimulus is appropriate. With moderate to high volume. Advanced, they may do loading strategies for multi-set exercises, 10 to 25 reps. So if you're doing 10, you might be filling the niche for endurance, filling the niche for strength, filling the niche for muscular hypertrophy. There's overlap between those three, and that's kind of which you see a lot of people, I'd say at the arc, that's where they're at. So if you're doing that, that's fine. You're hitting all the bases. You're not particularly excelling at one or the other, but if you're me, you don't really care. All you want, or what I wanted, was having a good physique, being strong. That was important to me, or strong relative to my body size, and that was about it. Being healthy, that's it. So whether I was specifically working on endurance or power, or I didn't really work on power, but strength or endurance or hypertrophy, sometimes it doesn't really matter. And if you have a good basic program going, you're incorporating the three to a degree, and it's fine. So 1 to 2 minutes, short rest periods. 1 to 2 minutes for high repetition sets, less for moderate. For circuit training, rest periods correspond to time needed to get from one exercise station to another. So there, the rest period with circuit training can be minimal. You see different variations of circuit training, and those are generally, they're okay. You just want to make sure that the program is overall sound. I'll leave it at that. Low frequency is effective in novice, so 2 to 3 days a week, again consistent with the other areas. For intermediate, 3 days a week. For total body workouts, and 4 days a week if you split it. Again, it's consistent with the other stuff. 4 to 6 days a week if you're a high-end advanced individual. It's recommended intentionally slow velocities be used when a moderate number of reps are used. If performing a large number of repetitions, then moderate to faster velocities are used. Make sure that the form is good. That's the key consistent thing there. Motor performance. We'll probably talk about this later as well. But motor performance is your plyometric exercise. Motor performance is your core exercise, functional exercise. Oh, I'm making myself tired. All of that goes under motor performance. One thing with power that I'll add in is that you need to make sure that your muscles are recruited in the correct order, and that takes coordination and a little skill and learning curve. That also goes into motor performance, being able to get the muscles to perform in a coordinated fashion. If you ever try to swing a golf club, that can be a challenge. If you're able to do it in a coordinated fashion, which a lot of middle-aged and older individuals are able to do it, as long as they have the flexibility and a modest level of strength, they're able to hit that ball straight and they can hit it for a mile. Other individuals might be super strong. You could get a bodybuilder or a strength athlete, and you try to get them to hit a golf ball. They don't sequence the movement properly, so they're not able to hit the ball as far. If they were able to sequence it properly, they would be able to hit the ball most likely further than the middle-aged and older individual. But it comes down to a lot of technique and a lot of skill, and that's where motor performance comes into play, and coordinating your movement comes into play. So motor performance is important. This is going to be more of your functional types of movements. Heavy and light loading, using a faster repetition velocity, moderate to high volume in a periodized fashion, 4 to 6 days per week. You're going to incorporate this with the rest of your program. So if you do some body weight exercises, some more complex types of movements, you're not going to be able to do it with any weight because just there's no real easy way to create resistance. But you're incorporating that into the rest of your routine, and that's what should be done, is to make sure that the motor performance becomes part of what you do. And in old school bodybuilding, old school strength training, what I did in the mainly in the early 90s, I didn't really do much motor performance. I did the standard lifts, bench press, dumbbell prep, dumbbell press, bicep curl, squats, lunges. I did all those types of things, but I really didn't do anything for motor performance, or not much. I should have incorporated more motor performance, and I would have incorporated my core, made my core stronger, types of exercises. I just didn't know any better. And I'd imagine there's a fair number of people at the ARC doing the same thing I did 20 years ago. So more than that, 25 years ago. So you just want to make sure that it's done, and that those types of movements are incorporated into the rest of what you're doing. So you can kind of double dip to a certain extent and just make sure that it's there. Plyometrics training is fine in combination with resistance is what they recommend. And lots of different ways to kind of get this done. It's recommended that heavy resistance and ballistic resistance exercise, along with sprint and plyometric training, be included in the progression of sprint ability. So that's really focused on the sprinting aspect. There. And this is where it becomes a good thing for discussion. What is motor performance? Does this count? Does that count? How do we incorporate that into a resistance exercise program? For the older adults, you notice that the older adult recommendations really aren't that much different than the novice recommendations for the general population. They can improve strength. They can have hypertrophy, do multiple and single joint, free weights, machines, slow to moderate velocity, 1 to 3 sets, 60 to 80%, 1 RM, 8 to 12 reps, 1 to 3 minutes of rest, 2 to 3 days a week. It's the same thing that you're doing in the rest of the population. There really isn't that much difference. You got to make sure that they're able to move properly. They're probably going to have limitations. They'll have arthritis. They'll have orthopedic injuries. They might have physiologic issues like high blood pressure or diabetes or some of those things that you also need to watch out and work with. But generally speaking, the exercise recommendation is pretty similar. Increasing power in healthier older adults, training to improve strength, performance of single and multi-joint exercises, 1 to 3 reps per exercising, light to moderate weight, 30 to 60% 1 RM. And that's what I love is they say 30-60% 1 RM. They always mention 1 RM. I'm a big fan of 1 RM. Nobody really measures 1 RM. And I think that's a mistake. People should be measuring 1 RM. Now, with power types of movements, I think doing some sort of repetition max is going to be more appropriate just because of the complexity of the movement and the danger associated with lifting weights heavy. But the key is you want to make sure that training stimulus is appropriate. So even though they're older, you want to make sure that weight is appropriate for them. You see these programs are lifting soup cans and whatever. That might be fine. If that's all you have available, fine. If that's all the person can lift, fine. But if the person can lift more, then they should be lifting more. So all things being equal in an ideal world, they have access to equipment, they're going to a gym, whatever. They should be making sure that they have the correct training stimulus just like the rest of us. You take the same precautions with the older individual as you would with anybody else, and vice versa. You want to look at any issues they have. We did all the pre-participation screening, all the, looking at their physiologic problems. So if you have a young person that's obese, sedentary, has arthritis, and they're 35 years old, you have to take that into consideration. Just because we'll even go even further, 25 years old. Just because they're 25 years old doesn't mean that we don't take these things into consideration. We do. And it's the same thing with the older individual. Whatever problems they're coming with, and they will come with problems, we just have to work with it and make sure that it works around the issues and it's safe and healthy and all that. But as far as the basic routine is concerned, and the basic recommendations are going to be the same, or pretty much the same. So For the power, it's the same recommendations, similar recommendations to older adults as young adults. For muscular endurance, there really isn't much difference there. So that's where I encourage you. Whether you will do it or not is another question, but I encourage you to read the rest of the article. If you're a strength and conditioning person and you like strength training, I'd recommend that you read the whole article. I recommend that you look at the National Strength and Conditioning Association materials. That'll give you some extra information, and you can kind of